This is our fifth lecture in the series from Chapter 11, and this lecture is about rangelands and livestock. So let's start off with a discussion of what rangelands and livestock even are. So first of all, rangelands are grasslands that are suitable for grazing cattle, sheep, and goats. People also sometimes graze llama on them, I think, but we're looking mainly at cattle, sheep, and goats, particularly cattle, because in the United States, we really like our beef. Now, rangeland grasses are considered a renewable resource. They're renewable as long as they're not overgrazed, and this is because grass grows from the roots. It doesn't grow from the tip. So a lot of plants grow from the tip, and once you cut the tip off, you cut the part that actually grows. Now, grass is different. Grass grows like our hair does. It grows from the roots. So as long as those roots are intact, and as long as there's a little bit of plant left that can produce, do photosynthesis and capture carbon dioxide from the air and produce glucose, we can continue to have that grass grow. This is why mowing your lawn does not prevent your grass from growing. It's why cutting your hair doesn't prevent your hair from growing. So as long as we use our grasslands sustainably, the grass is going to continue to grow back, and we will be able to continue to use those grasslands year in, year out. Now, overgrazing. Overgrazing is what happens when we don't use our grasslands sustainably. It's what happens when we allow too many cows in the field. So overgrazing will actually destroy grasslands, and it can lead to destroying riparian habitats as well. If you guys remember from our different field trips and lectures, riparian means near stream habitats. So if you have a river and you've got some trees growing around it, the trees are considered riparian habitat because they're next to a river. Now, the problem with overgrazing is that it reduces plant growth, and it also reduces the length of the roots that are developed at the bottom. So that will make it much easier for the soil in that region to erode. So once the grass is all eaten up, the root structure dies, and because it didn't penetrate very deeply into the soil, it can no longer anchor the soil. That leads to the erosion of our grassland habitats. It leads to erosion near streams. It can make streams really muddy and full of sediment if all that dirt is washing in. So these are cause some pretty big problems in this land that we're relying on to raise our beef for us. Now, non-native plants can also spread more easily into areas that have been overgrazed. So if you let your cattle completely overgraze your field and you're hoping that your grass is going to grow back, chances are you're actually going to get a non-native species instead, which may or may not be something that the cows would like to eat. So in order to help prevent overgrazing, the federal government passed what's called the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. Now, this act requires permits to graze on federal land. So it's not just anybody that can come in and let their cattle graze. You have to have a permit. And the goal of the act is to manage who grazes where and how much to prevent overgrazing. Now, this Taylor Grazing Act is a perfect example of a way of preventing the tragedy of the commons. So if all of our federal rangeland, our public rangeland, was just open to the public and anybody could put their cows there, we would assume that pretty quickly all of that land would be degraded. We'd have way more ranchers than we have grass for, way too many cattle, and the land would become overgrazed. But the Taylor Grazing Act prevents the tragedy of the commons because it manages who's allowed in, how much they can do, how much damage they can do, in other words. So that will help prevent the rangelands from being overgrazed, and it helps preserve our public resources. So we've been doing that in this country for quite a long time, which is why public rangelands would not necessarily be considered a commons in the United States because we have this regulation, although it is still a shared resource. All right, now a quiz question for you. True or false? Rangelands are a renewable resource. Is that A, true, or B, false? Go ahead and think about that for a minute. Pause if you need to. The correct answer is true. Rangelands are a renewable resource as long as they're managed properly. Now, let's talk about what other ways we raise animals in the United States, because I guarantee you most of our cows, most of the beef that we eat, not raised on rangelands. So, what we do in the United States is something called high-density animal farming, more commonly known as a CAFO. CAFO stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. So for example, we may be raising 2,500 hogs in one building, or 22,000 turkeys in one building. This picture here on the right shows a CAFO for cattle. Notice the cattle have very little room to move around. They're standing in their own manure, and those big troughs that run between the pens are filled up with corn every now and then, so the cattle walk over there, waddle over there, eat their corn, and then walk back and just sort of stand there. So this is not a very good environment. We'll talk about drawbacks in a minute. How do CAFOs operate? They rely on a high input of feed, so corn or soybeans. They also rely on use of antibiotics to help prevent the spread of diseases between these cattle. Because remember, if you have animals or people that are packed really, really tightly together, we end up with disease being spread much more easily because they're in such close contact. CAFOs also rely on nutrient supplements to help the cattle grow quicker, stronger, faster, and then sometimes they use growth hormones. There are federal regulations that prevent the use of growth hormones in certain animals, but then other animals they allow them. So what are some of the problems with CAFOs? Because you got to imagine there's lots of problems. So first of all, it's believed that there are several strains of antibiotic-resistant microorganisms that have developed in CAFOs because they use so many antibiotics that it's basically asking for natural selection to happen. So each time the antibiotic is introduced, it kills off most of the microorganisms. There are a few that survive, and those go on to reproduce and make the cows even sicker. So during slaughter, these microorganisms actually can be transferred to the meat, especially when the meat handlers are working really quickly, especially when they have to get through a certain number of cows per day. It's a really big problem. A simple flick of the wrist, and forgive the graphic picture here, but a slip of the wrist and they slice open the intestines and you get some fecal matter splattered all over your meat. If they don't clean that off very well, very, very well, or cut off the part that's been contaminated, they're going to end up transferring fecal bacteria into the food products that we eat. And that does happen, and that's why people die sometimes. Now, the production and misuse of manure in feedlots can lead to eutrophication. And I don't know if you can see there, they have these pools on the right, upper right hand, those brown pools. That's where the animal waste is being stored. So what happens is if that animal waste is mishandled, it can actually be accidentally discharged into local waterways or contaminate groundwater. One of the problems whenever we have a hurricane or whenever we have major flooding in a region from too much rain, there's a big potential for those animal waste lagoons to overflow. And then all of the bacteria, all of the manure, all of the fecal matter, all of that can the nutrients too can be discharged into local waterways, can even contaminate people's houses if they live near these feedlots. So this is a pretty big issue that we're hoping to avoid by using some other more sustainable methods of farming. So quiz question for you. Animals in CAFOs are given all of the following except feed, such as corn or soybeans, space to walk around, antibiotics, nutrient supplements, and sometimes hormones. So which of the following is the one that animals are not given? And the correct answer is B, space to walk around. So animals in concentrated animal feeding operations are not given lots of space to move around. They do have everything else. So they have enough to live, but not enough to move. All right, so what are some of our solutions to CAFOs? Well, first of all, we as consumers can buy free-range poultry and free-range grass-fed beef. These things are available at markets such as Whole Foods, Sprouts, Trader Joe's, some of the other sustainable markets. Mother's Market carries some of these. And there's a picture here of Trader Joe's organic free-range whole chicken. You can walk into the store and buy that. They also have it cut up for you if you don't want to buy the whole chicken. You can buy organic free-range breasts, thighs, legs, wings, whatever you want. The next picture in the middle there is of cows that are grass-fed beef. So they're actually walking around a pasture. This would be an example of a rangeland. They're walking around the rangeland eating grass and getting fat, and then when it's time to slaughter them, they're going to be slaughtered in the same way as other cows, but they won't have been exposed to the antibiotics, and they won't have as many of those disease-causing bacteria in their gut, so that they're not going to pose as great a risk to human health. And the sign there is an ad from Whole Foods, regionally raised grass-fed ground beef. So when you go to Whole Foods, you can choose how organic or how sustainable you want your meat to be. At the bare minimum, they have meat that was raised with a little bit extra space to move around. Then they also have a couple different steps along the way, and one of them is grass-fed ground beef. And you can also get organic too. So these are all really good options, and we'll talk a little bit at the end about what this means for you as consumers. All right, so let's talk now about the cost of eating meat. So first of all, livestock, as we saw with CAFOs, livestock that are raised in those CAFOs are going to require large amounts of energy to raise, and the waste is very difficult to dispose of. So managing all of the input of feed, the input of antibiotics, nutrients and things, and then getting rid of that manure and the waste is a big challenge. Secondly, it requires approximately 20 kilograms of grain to raise 1 kilogram of beef. So if you think about how this works out, the food that could be going to feed a single person then is turned around and is feeding a cow instead, which is then carved up to feed that person. So it's not a very efficient use of our resources. And something that many of you may not know is that the 20% of the richest people in the world eat 80% of the world's meat. So a large portion of the world is not eating meat because they just don't have it available to them. And we in the United States expect to have meat with every meal. I mean, if you don't have a little bit of meat on your salad or a little bit of protein with breakfast, we feel like we haven't eaten. So we are some of the biggest meat consumers in the world in this country, and we'll look in a minute at the kind of problems that poses. So here's a section on do the math. This is taken from your textbook. So if you've already done it in your book, you don't need to repeat it now, but we're going to go through it step by step to make sure everybody's on the same page when it comes to the actual amount of land required to feed the world. So we're going to look at what it would require to feed everybody in the world corn, and then what would be required if we wanted everybody in the world to eat beef. And I know these are two really extreme examples, but we're looking at a plant crop and we're looking at meat in comparison here. Obviously, we're not expecting everybody in the whole world to eat just corn, but this is just to make the calculations a little easier. So a couple things that we know. 1 hectare can produce 370 bushels of corn, and 1 bushel has 1,250 ears of corn in it. And 1 ear of corn contains 80 kilocalories, or capital C calories, of energy. Now, the average person needs 2,000 kcals a day in order to survive. And so the question is, how much land is required to feed one person if they only eat corn? Now, I'd like you to pause the recording here, work this out on your own, and then turn it back on, and I'll show you the solution. All right, so first, we're going to look at the food requirement. How much does a single person need per year? Now, 2,000 kilocalories per day times 365 days per year will give us an average yearly requirement of 730,000 kilocalories per year, and that's per person. So if we know that 1 hectare of land can produce a certain, let's go through the calculation here, 370 bushels of corn per hectare times 1,250 ears per bushel times 80 kilocalories per ear. If you multiply all those numbers out, we get that 1 hectare of land can produce 37 million kilocalories of food per year. Now, if we divide the daily requirement per person, 730,000 kilocalories per year, divide that by 37 million kilocalories per hectare, we would find out that it requires only 2/100ths of a hectare to feed a single person for a year, and that's if they're only eating corn. So our answer here is 0.02 hectares, also known as 1/50th of a hectare, if that person is only eating corn. So hopefully you got the right answer. Now let's look and see what happens if they're going to eat beef instead. We know that 20 kilograms of grain is required to produce 1 kilogram of beef. So how many hectares would be required to feed one person if they only ate beef? I'm also going to ask you to calculate 2 other things while we take this break here. First of all, the Earth has 1.5 billion hectares of arable land. That means land that can be used for farming. So how many people can we feed on planet Earth if we feed them using only grain, or in this case, corn? And then how many people can we feed if we eat only meat? So pause again and go ahead and work out the answers to those questions. Same kind of calculations. You're going to assume that because it takes 20 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of beef, we need 20 times the land to feed people beef. So that'll make your initial calculation easier. So go ahead and pause, and let's continue. So we would need approximately 20 times as much land, and if you take out the little calculation from our previous one, 2/100ths of a hectare times 20 is going to give you 4/10ths of a hectare per person required if everybody is eating beef instead of eating corn. So to feed one person for 1 year eating only beef, 4/10ths of a hectare, compared to 2/100ths of a hectare if they're eating corn. Now, the Earth has 1.5 billion hectares. Let's divide that by 0.02 hectares per person. That means that we can feed 75 billion people if everybody eats only grain or only corn. How many people can we feed if we eat only meat? Well, you can do this a couple ways. You could divide by 20, or we can do it like this: 1.5 billion hectares divided by 4/10ths of a hectare per person reveals that we can feed only 3.75 billion people if they're all eating meat. Now notice here the problem. We already have 7 billion people on the planet, so clearly we're not going to be able to meet human nutritional requirements feeding everybody only beef. But I'd like you guys to observe the vast difference there in how much food we can produce if people are eating grain versus how much food we can produce and people we can feed if they're eating meat. And this is one of those things where we really want to think about how our actions impact the rest of the world. So what does this mean for us? First of all, if we reduce our meat consumption in developed countries like the United States, we're going to help out the people in developing countries, in theory. The question is, would that really work? Would there really be increased food availability in developing countries if we cut back on the amount of meat we eat? One way to find out is to try it. Another way is to do some scientific studies. And it looks like that if we reduce the amount of meat we eat, that will free up farmers to produce other crops, which can then be used to distribute to other nations. Not to mention we'd probably be healthier. Now, as we reduce the land we use for agriculture, if we're actually able to move towards a grain-based diet or a plant-based diet, I'm not saying eliminate meat completely, but if we're able to reduce the amount of meat in our diet, then we're going to be able to reduce the land we use for agriculture in this country, which is going to mean that more land is going to be available as habitat. And that's really beneficial for biodiversity. So the bottom line for you guys is to, like we keep saying, vote with your dollar. When you go to the grocery store and you're choosing what to buy something that's organic, buy something that's free range or grass-fed if you're buying meat. And maybe choose to buy a little bit less meat because it's a little bit more expensive, but also because that way you're going to be reducing that meat consumption and you're going to be freeing up resources for other things. So that's my plug to you guys. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you all in class.